When you reported to the Presidential Working Group, including Secretary Paulson, Chairman Bernanke, Chairman Cox, and I think Chairman Lucan, did they direct you to do anything? Did they indicate that they would do anything? Essentially, what was their reaction?
No, but as you know, as you now know, the CFTC did it roughly the same time. I think in response to the similar concerns we had, did begin this investigation, ultimately involved other parties. And again, it took quite a bit of time, as these typically do. These are complicated things. But you had the CFTC and ultimately a variety of other regulatory enforcement authorities undertaking a very far-reaching investigation that's resulting in very tough enforcement actions.
One of the things I think this illustrates, again, is the rather ambiguous position of the President of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. This was brought to your attention. Did you communicate with Mervyn King on your own volition? Were you directed to do so?
No, I did that on my own.
And why would you do that if you were not responsible for, or clearly responsible for, the policy of the United States with respect to LIBOR or anything else? You were simply the chosen by the banking community of New York to regulate that bank.
Right. Well, I thought it was the responsible thing to do because it had broad implications not just for London but for the United States, and so I thought that was the appropriate, necessary thing.
Again, I think one of the things we tried to attempt in Dodd-Frank was to clarify the position of the President of the Federal Reserve Bank, the only person that has a statutory position, I believe, on the Open Market Committee, by making that position subject to confirmation and a point by the President confirmation. And ironically, it was rejected. In fact, on a bipartisan basis, all my colleagues were here. So that was one of my ideas that just didn't get any traction. But I think you would have been better served had you had much clearer authority and been on a level with the Secretary of Treasury and with the Chairman of the Federal Reserve and had clear enforcement responsibilities. What's your view?
Well, I think I would say it this way. We had a financial system before the crisis where you had a huge amount of risk and activity that had important implications for the average American economy that grew up outside the basic protections and safeguards and authorities we've put in place after the Great Depression to deal with these kind of problems. And that was a terribly damaging problem for us. And neither the Federal Reserve Bank of New York nor the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board or even the chairman of and women of the SEC and the CFTC had authority at that stage to deal with that huge growth of risk and activity. And as you saw, a lot of manipulation and abuse and fraud that came out outside the safeguards of the traditional banking system. So the crisis was so severe in part because of that problem, but of course also because within the banking system, the constraints on leverage and capital were just not sufficiently prudent or careful or conservative.
You now feel, given the Dodd-Frank legislation, that you have a much better capacity to deal with issues like this?
I do. I think as I said in my opening statement, it's not just that we forced $400 billion more capital into the banking system and negotiated much tougher constraints on capital and leverage globally with much tougher requirements on the largest banks so that large banks have to hold much more capital against risk than do small banks. We've given the authorities the ability to make sure that where there's risk outside that in derivatives or in the financial market infrastructure or in large institutions like AIG that are not banks but still present risk, that we can put similar constraints on leverage on them too. So I definitely believe that Dodd-Frank has put us in a much stronger position than we were before the crisis, even recognizing, of course, that you have to get these rules right, and there's a lot of work to do still to address the remaining challenges.
Let me raise a final point in a few moments. Because of the ubiquity of the LIBOR, this presents huge potential liabilities for the banking system back then and right now. On one side, you might have a borrower that's benefiting from depress rates, but then you have a bondholder that is not receiving what should be the rates that they contracted for. And obviously, was that a consideration in your discussions with the Presidential Working Group, that there could be huge potential liabilities for manipulation of this rate by particularly bondholders? And then moving to today, is that a potential going forward now where you have actively consideration of suits against multiple institutions by numerous bondholders?
Well, absolutely, that was a concern then, and that's a critical concern going forward. And as I said in my opening statement and my initial remarks to the chairman's question, one of the issues that the Fed and the SEC and the CFTC are working on now, which the Council will review, is to make sure they're carefully examining not just the remaining implications for the integrity of the system, but reforms and alternatives to make sure we address those remaining problems. That'd be a critical focus of the remaining work ahead. And again, that basic